The mountain men of the American West have been turned into legends. Bearded trappers in buckskin riding into the sunset. Free spirits conquering the frontier with nothing but a rifle and a dream. But there is a part of this story that almost nobody tells. Behind nearly every one of these men was a woman, a wife, usually native, usually very young. And her life was so brutal, so physically punishing, and so quietly heroic that the entire myth of the mountain man could not have existed without her. This is the true story of what it actually took to be a mountain woman in the fur trade era. A life of childbirth alone in the snow. Of scraping animal hides until your fingers bled. Of walking 300 miles through a frozen wilderness with 2 starving children tied to your back. Of burying babies in shallow graves and getting back on the horse the next morning because stopping meant dying. And for most of these women, it began with a marriage that was not really a marriage at all. In the 1820s and 1830s, the American fur trade depended on one thing above all else. Not rifles, not traps, native wives. When a white trapper arrived in the Rocky Mountains, he could not survive the first winter on his own. He did not know how to make snowshoes that would hold his weight in deep powder. He did not know which plants were food and which were poison. He could not sew a buckskin coat that would keep him alive at 30 below zero. He could not even waterproof his own moccasins. So he did the only thing that made sense. He found a native woman and he married her. These were called country marriages. Or in the French of the old fur traders, marriage à la façon du pays. There was no priest. There was no paperwork. A trapper would approach the woman's father or brothers, offer gifts, usually tobacco, knives, beads, sometimes a horse, and if the family agreed, the marriage was done. The woman had almost no say in any of it. Most were teenagers. Some were as young as 14. And here is the part that made these marriages especially dangerous for the women. They were not legally binding. A trapper could ride away at any moment. He could take a second wife in the next valley over. He could abandon his mountain family entirely and return to a legal wife back in Montreal or St. Louis, and the law would say he had done nothing wrong. Thousands of native women in the fur trade era spent their entire adult lives knowing that the man they had married could vanish any morning and never come back. One of these young women was named Marie. She was from the Iowa tribe, and she was barely out of childhood when she was handed over to a trapper named Pierre Dorion, a half-Sioux, half-French-Canadian man who worked the fur routes out of St. Louis. Marie could not have known it yet, but she was about to live one of the most extraordinary survival stories in American history. And she was going to show every trapper around her exactly who was really keeping them alive. There is a story from early in their marriage. Pierre had been hired by the Astor Expedition, paid a generous advance to serve as a guide and interpreter on the first overland journey to the Pacific. And he took the money, went to a saloon, and started drinking it away. When Marie confronted him, he struck her across the face. So Marie picked up a heavy wooden club, knocked him unconscious with a single blow, and dragged him back to camp to make sure he honored the contract. That was a mountain woman, not a damsel, not a silent companion, the engine of the whole operation. Here is something the history books almost never say out loud. Women were the primary producers of the American fur trade, not the men. The trapper caught the beaver. That was maybe 10% of the actual work. Everything after that was his wife. She was the one who skinned the animal with a sharpened knife, working from the tail up, peeling the hide away from the flesh in one unbroken piece. She was the one who stretched that hide on a wooden hoop made from a bent willow branch. She was the one who knelt over it for hours with a bone scraper, called a beamer, and shaved every scrap of fat and sinew off the inside, her arms burning, her shoulders locked in the same position until she could barely stand up straight. When the hide was clean, she rubbed it with a mixture of animal brains and warm water. That is not a joke. It is how every buckskin garment in the American West was tanned. The brain oils break down the fibers and make the leather soft. After the brain treatment came the smoking. She would build a small fire of rotted wood, suspend the hide over it inside a cone of sticks, and let the smoke cure the leather for another full day. A single mountain woman might process 15 or 20 beaver pelts in a week during peak season, and in addition to the pelts, she was processing deer hides, elk hides, and buffalo robes for her own family's clothing. She did not stop there. She made the moccasins her husband wore. Every trapper in the Rockies wore footwear that his wife had cut, stitched, and beaded by hand, often in the dark, often by firelight after a 14-hour day. She made the snowshoes that let him walk across winter terrain, bending ash wood into curved frames and lacing them with rawhide strips she had cut herself. She sewed his coats, his mittens, his leggings. She built the canoes that carried the furs to market, stitching birch bark together with spruce root, sealing the seams with pine pitch she had boiled in a cast-iron pot. And then there was the food. She pounded dried buffalo meat mixed with rendered fat and dried berries into pemmican, the high-calorie survival food that kept entire fur brigades alive through the winter. Making pemmican was its own kind of back-breaking labor. You start by drying strips of lean meat in the sun or over a slow fire for days. You pound the dried meat into a coarse powder with a stone hammer. You render fat from bone marrow in a heavy pot. You mix it all together with Saskatoon berries or choke cherries. You pour it into rawhide bags and seal the edges with more hot fat. One woman working full days could produce enough pemmican in a week to feed 6 men for a month. Without pemmican, the Western fur trade simply would not have existed. One old Dean guide named Mattanabbey put it plainly to a Hudson's Bay Company explorer in 1771. He said, "One woman can carry or haul as much as 2 men. She pitches the tents, she makes and mends the clothing. She keeps us warm at night. There is no such thing as traveling any distance in this country without her." And all of this was happening in temperatures that regularly dropped to 40 below, in wind that cut through 3 layers of hide, in isolation so complete that a mountain woman could go months without seeing another female human being. Marie Dorion on the Astor expedition was the only woman in a party of 62 men. She had nobody to talk to, nobody to share the grief of a miscarriage with, nobody to teach her daughters the songs her own mother had taught her. She was pregnant the entire way. There were no doctors in the mountains, no midwives, no clean water, no medicine. If you were a mountain woman and you went into labor in whatever shelter happened to be nearby. A canvas tent, a lean-to made of pine boughs, a half-frozen cabin with a dirt floor. Sometimes nothing at all, just a blanket on the snow and the cold sky overhead. Native women who grew up in their own tribes had networks of aunts and grandmothers and experienced midwives who had delivered hundreds of babies. Country wives who traveled with trapping parties had none of that. When the contractions started, the only people around were men who had never seen a child born in their lives and did not want to be anywhere near it. When Marie Dorion's labor started in late December 1811, the Astor expedition was moving through the Grande Ronde Valley in what is now eastern Oregon. The wind was cutting through the pine forest. The snow was piled knee-deep. The men did not stop for her. They could not afford to. They kept walking, leaving Marie and her husband behind in a makeshift shelter made of bent branches and hide scraps. She gave birth that night. The baby was a boy. She wrapped him in a scrap of wool blanket and held him against her chest to keep him warm through the first freezing night of his life. He lived 8 days. He died in her arms somewhere on the trail, and she buried him in a shallow grave in frozen ground because that was all the ground would give her. The next morning, Marie caught up to the expedition on horseback. She was carrying her 2-year-old son on one hip, her dead infant's blanket still tucked into her coat, and holding the reins of her horse with her free hand. One of the American expedition leaders, a writer named Washington Irving, would later describe the moment in his journal. He wrote that the mother looked as unconcerned as if nothing had happened to her. That was not stoicism. That was not toughness. That was the face of a woman who understood that if she allowed herself to feel what had just happened, she would not survive the next hour. And she had 2 other children who needed her to survive. This was the reality of mountain motherhood. Infant mortality in the fur trade era was staggering. Some historians estimate that half of all children born to mountain women in the 1820s and 1830s did not live to see their 5th birthday. Disease, cold, malnutrition, accidents, and the brutal physical demands of a nomadic life killed children faster than their mothers could bear them. Women would strap a toddler to a cradleboard and carry that cradleboard on their back for 12 hours a day while they worked, scraped hides, cooked, walked alongside pack horses, and then nursed the child through the night before doing it all over again the next morning. Some of them lost 3, 4, 5 children in a row. And they kept going, because there was no other choice. And for Marie Dorion, the hardest part of her story had not even started yet. January 14, 1814. Marie was at a small fur trading post in what is now southern Idaho. Her husband, Pierre, was out on the trap line with a party of other trappers. A Shoshone scout rode into camp and told Marie that a band of Bannock warriors was planning to attack Pierre's party. So Marie did what any mountain woman would do. She bundled her 2 sons, now ages 4 and 6, into warm clothes, put them on a horse, and rode out into the snow alone to warn her husband. It took her 3 days to reach Pierre's cabin. 3 days riding through freezing mountain passes with 2 small children clinging to her back. When she finally got there, she looked through the open door and saw her husband on the floor. He had been scalped. The blood was already frozen to the wooden planks. One trapper named Giles Leclerc was still alive but badly wounded, bleeding out into the snow outside the cabin. She strapped him to her horse and turned back toward the main camp. A 3-day ride through the freezing wilderness. He died on the 2nd night, slumped forward in the saddle. When Marie finally reached the main camp with her 2 sons and the body of Leclerc, she found every man there had been killed and scalped. The bodies were scattered across the snow. The horses were gone. The supplies had been taken. She was alone in the wilderness in the middle of January, with 2 small children and almost no food. She did not break down. She did not sit in the snow and cry. She grabbed what she could, a few hides, some dried fish, 2 remaining horses that had wandered back into camp, a dull knife, a handful of blankets, and she rode west into the Blue Mountains, trying to reach the friendly Walla Walla people who lived near the Columbia River. The snow stopped her. It fell so deep in the mountains that the horses could not move their legs through the drifts. Marie found an isolated ravine, a narrow cut between 2 ridges that gave her some shelter from the wind, and she made her decision. She killed both horses. She butchered them in the snow with her dull knife, her hands going numb, her children watching. She used their hides to build a small shelter, stretching the raw hide over a frame of bent pine branches. She smoked the horse meat over a slow fire. She stacked the bones inside the shelter to use later for broth. And then she waited. She stayed in that ravine for 53 days. 53 days, alone, in the Blue Mountains, in the dead of winter, with 2 small children. She rationed the horse meat as long as she could. When it ran out, she made snare traps from the hair of the dead animals' manes and tails, twisting the horsehair into loops and setting them along small animal tracks in the snow. The traps caught mice. They caught squirrels. Sometimes they caught nothing for 3 days in a row. She collected frozen berries from under the snow and thawed them against her chest. She stripped the soft inner bark off pine trees and boiled it into a thin paste that her boys could swallow. She denied herself food so her sons could eat. Some days she ate nothing at all. She kept the fire burning through blizzards that would have killed a grown man in an hour. She listened for wolves every night. She watched her children grow thinner and quieter. She sang them the songs her mother had taught her, in a language no one else in those mountains could understand. just to keep them from losing hope. In March, when the snow finally began to thin, she knew she had to move. Her boys were too weak to walk. She was too weak to carry them far, so she wrapped them in the last buffalo robe she had and hid them inside a snow cave she dug by hand into a drift. She told them to stay quiet. She told them she would come back. Then she walked, and when she could no longer walk, she crawled. Actually crawled on her hands and knees through the freezing mud and slush of early spring because her legs could no longer hold her upright. She crawled for days, eating nothing, drinking from the runoff of melting snowbanks until she saw smoke rising in the distance. It was a Walla Walla village. The villagers took her in, fed her, and sent a rescue party back for her sons. Both boys were still alive. Barely, but alive. Marie Dorion had just survived one of the most extraordinary feats of wilderness endurance ever recorded on the American frontier. She had walked into hell and walked out dragging her children behind her, and almost nobody knows her name today. Here is the darker ending to the mountain woman's story. Most of them did not get the life Marie Dorion eventually had. By the 1840s, the fur trade was collapsing. Beaver hats were going out of fashion in Europe. The mountain men were retiring. And a new wave of settlers, this time including white women, was arriving from the east. Suddenly, the native wives who had taught these men everything, who had kept them alive, who had borne their children, were no longer convenient. They were an embarrassment. Fur trappers abandoned their native wives by the thousands. And some rode off without saying goodbye. Some remarried white women from Missouri or Ohio and pretended their mountain families had never existed. Some sent their mixed-race children away to boarding schools and never saw them again. The forts of the Hudson's Bay Company and the American Fur Company were flooded with requests from abandoned women trying to get support for children they could not feed. Most of those requests were denied. Consider a woman named Koth-Ko-Kone. She was the daughter of a Piegan warrior, married to an American Fur Company clerk named Malcolm Clark in 1844 when she was still a teenager. She bore him 4 children. She moved with him to Michigan and then back west to a ranch near Helena. She watched him send her 2 oldest children east for schooling, knowing she would probably never see them again. She watched him bring home a second wife, a mixed-race woman named Good Singing, and she accepted her into the household because she had no choice. When Clark was murdered in 1869, Koth-Ko-Kone was left with nothing. Her children's accounts say the loss broke her completely. She lived another 26 years in grief and died in 1895, and her story is one of hundreds just like it. In 1837, a steamboat carrying smallpox came up the Missouri River. The disease tore through the fur trading forts. Mountain women, who spent their days in close contact with European traders, were among the first to catch it and among the first to carry it home to their tribal families. Entire villages were wiped out in weeks. Some native wives watched their children, their parents, their brothers and sisters, and their whole extended family die within a single month. There are stories of women who buried 30 relatives in a single summer and then went back to scraping hides the next day because there was nothing else to do. The women who survived all of this rarely got old. The average mountain woman who made it past 40 was considered ancient. Her hands were gnarled from decades of hide scraping. Her back was permanently bent from carrying loads that would break a modern athlete. Her face was lined from 30 winters of wind and smoke. Her teeth were worn down to stumps from chewing leather to soften it for sewing. She had buried more children than she had living. She had watched her language and her traditions become something her grandchildren were ashamed of. Marie Dorion was one of the lucky ones. She remarried twice after Pierre's death, raised more children, and eventually settled in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. She became known in her community as Madame Iowa. When she died in 1850, she was buried inside the original log Catholic church in the town of St. Louis, Oregon. It was an honor almost never given to women, and never before to a native woman. The priests who buried her must have understood, at least partly, what she had lived through. But here is the cruel final twist. In 1880, that church burned to the ground. When the new church was built on the same site, no one remembered exactly where Marie had been buried. Her grave was lost. To this day, one of the toughest human beings who ever crossed the American West lies in an unmarked spot somewhere beneath a parish floor in rural Oregon, forgotten by the country she helped build. The myth of the Mountain Man is one of the most powerful stories in American culture. The buckskin hero, the lone wolf, the man who needed nothing and no one. But that myth is a lie. Every one of those men was carried on the back of a woman whose name was never written down, a woman who scraped his hides, sewed his coats, nursed his children, made his food, taught him how to survive a winter, and more often than not, saved his life at least once. A woman who did all of this in a world that offered her no protection, no medicine, no rest, and in the end, usually no gratitude and no grave. The American West was not built by mountain men, it was built by the women who kept them alive. Women like Marie Dorion, who walked through 53 days of frozen hell with 2 children on her back and came out the other side still breathing. Women like Kothko Kona, who gave everything to a man who replaced her twice and left her with nothing. Women whose names we will never know because nobody bothered to write them down. If you want to hear more forgotten stories from the real American frontier, subscribe. There are 100 more women like Marie Dorion buried in the footnotes of history, and they all deserve to be remembered.